Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Jimbob from MadeByJimbob. He's a cartoonist and a content creator, a comedian of quite a wild stripe, as well as an Orthodox Christian. And in this conversation, we talk about mostly his Christianity, the theological aspect of that, and how it aligns or doesn't align with modern, American political categories. Though he's certainly a conservative and on the right. However, the slander that is coming from the center towards the right doesn't quite add up in his mind, especially this woke right sloganeering that we're hearing so much of. If you are hyper online, like I am, but if you're not hyper online, this is a great deep dive into the logic behind belief in God and all that that entails. You can find links to Jimbob's work down there in the description, as well as links to support this channel. Without further ado, here is Jimbob.
What's this refined, clean shaven thing?
I don't know. It just happened. It'll grow back. It's on its way. Do you ever do that? Do you ever indulge on the baby face?
Well, I did make a mustache, and my kids had never seen me without a beard. So I went with a clean shaven with a mustache, and man, it felt like I was a stranger in the house.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Totally
disconcerting
ostracized.
for all involved.
Yeah, I would like catch one of my daughters just looking at me from across the room, like sort of like. They didn't even say anything. That's actually worse. There was nothing said.
Oh, wow.
The palpability of silent judgment.
You're teaching them to be strong female characters.
Yeah, totally.
2025. What's on your mind?
Oh, not much. Just floating in the zeitgeist.
Oh,
the
yeah.
matrix of argumentation and bickering and quarreling.
Yeah, I'm getting swept up in it too.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what the point is of it, but
Yeah, I'm trying to question that. My cope is that it's entertaining. So either I'm indulging in content that's entertaining, and I need that because I don't watch silly shows necessarily on TV, but I'm also in the TV. I'm in the show that I'm watching. And so maybe my cope is, well, I'm providing entertainment to people in doing examination and summarizing and things like that. And, you probably get it in your own chat and comments that they thank you for providing whatever the category is. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're in a Truman Show of our own making.
Mm-hmm.
More often than not.
Yeah. But the recent topic is good. I'm glad you invited me. Thank you, because it's been a topic I've been looking at and going, there's something nebulous about this. And somehow it's like a puzzle that's not quite going to fit together, but like James Lindsay's trying to make it fit. And you're like, well, what are these pieces? And it's like, he won't tell you. He's like, the puzzle's there. I'm going to cryptically deliver some breadcrumbs, and you have to chew on it and figure it out. And I'm like, what is this? It's so bizarre considering he's done so much work sort of highlighting Gnosticism and its failures to simply chase new information and try to piece together like this like game. But he seems to be kind of doing that at the same time, where he's like, I'm gonna give you some stuff, but when I'm questioned about the rigidity of the claims, I'm not gonna really engage.
Yeah, I think I'm now in the woke right camp.
Okay. From your own choosing, or they cascaded it over to you?
Well, one, speaking with people who have been defined as woke right, and who gets to define that? I guess if we go by James's definition, then he definitely says that certain people are woke right. And I've spoken with those people, and I've tried to understand their arguments and then provide those arguments to what, for lack of a better term, are the classical liberals, or maybe the 90s liberals,
Sure.
Or the pre-progressive liberals. Because things have changed so much. We're kind of through yet another mirror, speaking Alice in Wonderlandly. After Trump got elected, that's when the focus on anti-wokeness switched to a focus, like the same tools, or at least the same paradigm or pattern recognition software was then applied to the right. But I've been looking into the right for a while, and I don't really know how to define it other than not left. And the most smart ways of analysis, the most smart analyses of the right have usually broken it up into 3 or 4 different camps. So there's no one right.
Yeah, the right fights with itself, right? That people identify as right. I'm right. I'm considered further right. And I fight with people who say they're on the right all the time. I think the thing that you pointed to is interesting is like when we think about what wokeness is, I think of it's not just the behavior that these people would be doing. For instance, taking over aspects of government and informing policy from their ideology. It would be sort of like woke would be sort of, at least how I experienced it since 2016 on, would be a type of activism, a type of social justice sort of phenomenon where you're virtue signaling for some sort of outcome, that something's unfair. So, but the thing is, woke couldn't simply be tied to behaviors, and that's what's kind of like what I find annoying about the whole the whole term trying to be forced upon us, where people aren't actually making that connection. Like someone like Lindsay would say, well, the right is now doing this thing. Well, I mean, so what? Like if the behavior is pushing back against something that they disagree with, I'm not sure what the criticism is. For instance, one of the limitations I find with classical liberalism and sort of like the faux conservative arm of politics and entertainment is that they have this kind of classical liberal loyalty, but then they pretend they're fighting against the wrong liberalism. But when it comes down to it, like someone like Ben Shapiro, for instance, would say like, well, I don't agree with the left, like taking over government and you know, getting in positions of power. We got to push back on that. And then you go, well, is it okay for me as a Christian to assume a position of power and inform policy from my view? And he said, no, absolutely not. That's what the left does. Like they basically do this thing where they smear one camp for doing a thing. But the only real, from my view, the only real question is, what is the ideology or worldview that's informing these things? What they're doing, I'm not opposed to people assuming positions of power in government and informing from their ideology. The question is whether or not their ideology is coherent or not. You don't want to remove the ability for you and let's say a populist crowd to kind of cultivate presence in government. You want to utilize government, because that's the system we have, to express your values. It seems to me that people on the right are starting to wake up to this view that liberalism and the woke right, the woke right are basically anyone who, this is how I look at it. It is a reduction. I think James Lindsay and company calling anyone woke right are really just pointing to anyone who's seeing that valuing liberty above their duty is incorrect. When it comes down to it, anyone who questions liberty as the highest priority in the world, in reality, in your life, is seen as some sort of danger. And this is just false. It's just a smear campaign, because people, especially younger men, are realizing as they move closer to traditionalism, many moving to Orthodox Christianity, some Catholicism, they're starting to see that their place in the world is given by a deontological position, not a I deserve liberty position. And so they're starting to, at least in my experience, they're starting to understand that duties, especially from a Christian perspective, are actually more important. They trump this concept of liberty as some sort of holy grail, right? Yeah. I'm not saying liberty itself isn't a necessary component, but it's not the ultimate component.
Yeah. Well, there has to be a voluntary acceptance of those duties, or I guess that I think that would be where the liberal would put things. Yes, we want responsibilities, not just rights, but we have to be free to choose the responsibilities. There has to be liberty
to act them out, to basically participate.
Yeah, to accept them. We have to accept them. It's a very strong culture of consent, which is liberty, which progressivism has taken so far that now, in college campuses throughout America, sex education is primarily about consent. And just like this whole bureaucratic process of, saving yourself from the litigation aspect of something going wrong, right?
Yes.
So I see a lot of the ideas in liberalism have kind of gone off the rails. I don't know. And I see the right saying, well, we need duties. We need these other things. We want to put the priority on responsibilities over rights.
Yeah.
And yet I think the liberal kind of has daddy issues. They have problems with authority. They have problems with leadership too. And that's another interesting aspect of the anti-woke crowd going against this they're now being anti-woke right. It doesn't seem like that they are inspiring leadership so much as just repurposing the same tools of tribalistic online political agitation to their own ends. So they're behaving just as woke. If we just distill woke into behavior, you slander people, you try to, you don't necessarily even deplatform people as you try to insinuate that platforming is a moral choice. And so we should platform people who are the correct people, the experts in a certain way, shape, or form. So everybody's using the same tools because those tools are just the way that human beings as social animals behave.
It's also just a convergence that's going on where like every ideology, every group, every subgroup now has access to the same tools and has access to basically the connectivity of the network itself. And so people on Twitter now, like, no names from TikTok are suddenly launched into superstardom and people are, converging from what I call the panel verse. They're now on mainstream television, right? And so it's all converging at the same time. But to point to one thing you said is the thing about holding to a rights-based system solely, there's nothing about a right descriptively that gives anyone an obligation to do anything. So if I have the right to own a gun, nowhere in the right to own a gun is it said that I have an obligation to own a gun. Anything you list as a right, and this is a critique of liberals and classical liberals and the conservatives who basically pose as sort of right-wingers, but ultimately are just covert liberals or covert feminists or whatnot, is that ultimately they're saying, no, we gotta really focus on just the rights aspect. And if a right is simply an allowance, a set of behaviors you're allowed to do with a set of constraints of things you're not allowed to do, if nowhere in there is the obligation, as a society, as a nation, if there's nothing embedded as an obligation, and I'm not saying just legally, I'm not saying you get arrested for not fulfilling your obligation. I'm saying the narrative is missing something that's key to any thriving civilization, which is this notion that the civilization as a whole has an obligation, and men, let's say, and women have different duties and obligations, and that's understood. Liberalism has basically allowed us to sort of dilute or erase or reformat these things. So there's no real universality to a man's duty to society. It's gone from a liberal perspective.
What do you mean?
Like the question is, do men have any duty in society? If you just ask any man. From a liberal perspective, what can they say? Well, no, I don't have to do anything. You can't tell me what to do.
Yeah, you can't tell me what to do. But why is obligation important? And let's pick an example. You brought up a gun. How would we be obligated, to own a gun or to use a gun correctly or to use the gun for the correct thing?
I think maybe all three would be assumed in the ownership of a gun. One is you would have an obligation to operating it safely, properly, in the right circumstances, even if those things are elusive, because they're completely context and situational dependent. the assumption is, well, you have an obligation to work it properly. Okay. Well, you have an obligation to why do you have a gun? Well, to defend your life and your family and perhaps your property, something you have in your possession, your house. So, but what gives you the obligation? What is it derivative of? Well, it's not derivative of a purely liberal worldview. There's nothing in classical liberalism that tells you why we have a duty to defend our families, why we have a duty to defend our common man and our neighbor. It's not embedded in the definition.
No.
So what I'm arguing is that you're going to need something extra constitutional, outside of that worldview to then say, well, why is it we even do these things? Why is it we even value some of these things?
Yeah.
Which is why I think men, especially younger men, are starting to see the failures of liberalism and classical liberalism. And they're starting to move over to what's seen as a more extreme position, which is why you get these James Lindsay's trying to hang on to any last dingleberry of the false dialectic of right, left, bad liberals versus good liberals. It's not working anymore. That's why this whole woke right thing isn't landing, because people see through it. It's a clear demonstration of saying, if you challenge liberty, the idea that liberty is above all the best thing, is the virtue itself, people are challenging that. But it's scary to classical liberals, and it's scary to liberals themselves. It's scary to a lot of people if people are starting to take on this view and they go, wait a second. Well, what is the value? Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, to what degree can you stomach authoritarianism? If that's the dialectic?
I think. Well, that's what's funny is that I think you can't avoid authoritarianism. The question is, let's say authoritarianism is on a scale of 1 to 10. I'm not even sure where I would place the concept of a constitutional republic, a representative republic, because the concept of rights is still using some sort of authoritarianism. For instance, if I don't believe in human rights, if I just take that position, there's many people who don't take the position, and someone says, you have the right to believe whatever you want, just don't force your beliefs on me. Well, if I don't believe in rights, wouldn't that at least get you on the board of authoritarianism? Saying, oh, no, we're okay with you believing things. We just don't want to force your beliefs on others. That's why we're against Christians, expanding their paradigm into government. And I go, well, what about rights? What if someone doesn't believe in rights? Well, no, that doesn't count. We have to force the belief of rights onto people. I mean, what other choice do we have? What I'm saying is that even that is authoritarian. So the question is, to what extent we accept authoritarian, right? Authoritarianism is your question.
The next step down to it is how authority behaves, and that would be plotted on a spectrum between, and maybe this is false dichotomy, but between persuasive, aka propagandistic,
sure,
or coercive, aka militaristic, just in your face, pure force. Yeah,
I like the combo of two of those, honestly.
And it seems like in my conversations, sorry about the chickens, in my conversations with classical liberals, very intelligent people, they're kind of like libertarians, where they kind of assume that everybody's smart enough to behave according to the laws that they have a hard time explicating. But they have this difficult time seeing that what they're doing is propaganda. Sure. They know that they're not being coercive, and they know that they need to educate. That's one of the well, how do we change cultures in order for cultures to act in this liberal way? Well, we have to educate them. Well, that's propaganda.
Right.
That we are brainwashing people, either intentionally or not, into a certain mode of being. And if you don't want to go through the route of religion, you have to go through the technocratic education system. That's what you're left with. And what does the technocratic education system end up believing in and of itself? Like, what is the value? Is that value neutral, or does it, as the critics of propaganda and technocracy, Jack Ellul would say, it has its own content. It has its own moral dogma, ontology telos, and it usually defaults to making more of itself, to replicating itself. Standardized testing, consent-based morality, racism. Race and sex become these markers, and then we start to redistribute things in order to, graph equality is manifested in the graph, and the graph is always going up, right? So there's always going to be some morality. Does that morality actually hold up? What does that do to human beings? Is that a human morality, or is it wearing humanity like a skin suit?
Yeah, I think all of that, I think, is a good way to summarize it. I would say that there's no such thing as neutrality. Secularism tries to assume that, no, they're coming into these positions and all of the things that they're advocating for is totally neutral. It's just empiricism. It's just, we're just looking at the world as it is. No, that's never the case. You're always importing some sort of dogma. The moment you say we ought to pursue X, Y, Z, you're assuming a meta-ethical position. Ought not to as well. So I wish people would just be more honest that they have, generally speaking, they have religious beliefs, even if it's absent a belief in a God. They have these views, and it's just better to admit it, that you want to use government to inform and enforce your ideology. Like, I wish people would just come out and say it.
Why don't they? Why does the liberal have a hard time?
Well, I think the liberal and the classical liberal thinks they're violating something, ultimately, and maybe there's some social shame that comes with it. Why? Well, in today's society, if you question liberty above all, you're kind of seen automatically as some sort of scary authoritarian. But that's actually not an ought claim necessarily yet. That's just a descriptive claim saying, wait, maybe liberty descriptively isn't the highest virtue. They don't even want to engage with that descriptive potential statement. They skip to, well, then you're going to take everyone around, you're going to throw people off roofs, and you're going to do this and that. They always skip to this sort of view. Yeah. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, can we all agree descriptively that we have ideologies, and you cannot divorce your worldview from the practice of, say, making laws or voting for making laws or anything else. You can't separate these things. So there's no neutrality. It seems to me, if the question is, why is it they can't grasp this? Why is it they don't want to talk about this? I think the entailment would be suddenly people are on equal playing ground. The equal game, the playing ground is whoever can race and populate the government can inform the laws. And so that's actually consistent with the system we have, which is funny. That's totally
government
consistent.
Of the people, by the people, and for the people. And
that's
the people
right. So that's
are people, and they believe in things.
The government's made of people, and the people have views. The problem is, on the right side, they're just as reactive as the left side when it comes to sort of the dissident right or the extreme right, or whatever you want to call them, the woke right. It's James Lindsay calls it. He says they're anti-liberty. No, that doesn't follow that someone's anti-liberty because they address and properly summarize that liberty itself can't be the highest virtue. It can't be. Mm-hmm. There's something else in play.
Yeah, in the classical liberal imagination, they're constantly trying to carve out this island that is distinct and yet caught between via horseshoe theory. So they're always tying themselves to these two extremes. It's either gay race communism or the Taliban. Mm-hmm. And they are an island of sanity between those two poles that they then are able to kind of push everybody
kind of like libertarianism is a little bit. They think they're like a self-existing floaty raft between the evil boats that are fighting, and they're the reasonable ones in between, and yet at any given moment they'll move closer to one boat or the other on a topic, and they can't agree, right, on the what the neutrality actually is. But I think when you talk about this, the two elements of authority versus persuasion, propaganda versus law, I think the propaganda is very powerful. I think taking that approach, being that I'm a comic maker, I'm a cartoonist, I admittedly am a propagandist in a sense. Now, people think propaganda means like, you're lying,
or manipulative,
lying. No, I don't take that approach. I think what it is there's a narrative to proliferate, and try to pierce into the culture, and it's very effective. We know this looking at the whole COVID thing. We know that there is a larger, at least in my experience, a larger element of propaganda and social pressure that was influencing things than law. I would say it was like a 10 to 90% perhaps. I could be
the law
wrong
merely
about that.
allowed it.
Yeah, it just kind of permitted it, but they just watched as people did what people do, which is when they're in fear and they're unknown, they stick to safety above all, and that really sets off the sort of the critical point, right, where they all go, well, everyone just cover themselves in plastic then. And we saw, looking back, we go, oh, that worked. That the technique itself worked. Now it's important.
Everybody was in a hijab, at least over their mouth holes.
And I think what's happening now is a sort of Mott and Bailey, I think it would be called, where you look at the mechanisms and methods and behaviors they used during that time, and then you say anyone who uses the same methods must be as wrong. But I reject that. I actually reject that. I think that, let's take, for instance, let's look at like mask wearing or something. That was a public indecency. That was like a social taboo to not wear one, right? Well, if I swap that with, let's say, basic public indecency like nudity or sexual simulating sex in public, even if
or
you're
yoga
fully
pants,
clothed.
would you go as far as yoga pants?
No, I wouldn't go as that far.
Oh.
But
so even you have
admittedly,
a line,
admittedly,
liberal line.
there's a line I might not know exhaustively what it is.
Yeah.
But let's just take this example. If it's the case that I use all of the same tactics as they did during the Karunka fiasco, it doesn't follow that I'm wrong for using the tactics of social pressure and social shame and pointing and ostracization. It doesn't follow. The problem is with this false dialectic of the right and the left, and the James Lindsay narrative is basically, if you do this, you're just like them. Well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with doing those things if it's informed by a different philosophy, if it's informed by a worldview that's actually coherent?
I guess you would have to then ask, well, what's the proper way to influence society in your direction? If those tools are off the table, if propaganda broadly is off the table, I guess what you're left with is the liberal probably say argumentation, rational argumentation, reasoning, right? But I don't see that actually happening.
Yeah, you're going to reason with Hawk Tuah? You're going to debate Hawk Tuah? No, reasoning, like, that's the thing, is like, people are sheep, and I don't mean that in an insulting way. I'm just as much of a sheep in a different way, but it's just that you can't rely on this assumption that everyone's like educated enough to debate or educated enough to inform their vote and all of these things. People in a society definitionally is a more or less ordered aggregate of people. Now, to say that it's ordered, you couldn't divorce the word order from the definition of society, right? So if that's the case, who's doing the ordering? It can't be all of the people. That doesn't make any sense. That's like a power pluralism. That would assume everyone has equal power in devising what the order is. That's like saying, if we just got together, we could on Tuesdays make it so that we drive on different sides of the road, right? If we just vote for hard enough, we can do that. It's like, no, there's going to be a way in which you participate in society, and there's going to be an implied ought, that you ought to abide by the rules of law, that you ought to maintain decency, don't cause a ruckus. Now, is that authoritarian, the social pressure of that, to keep that governed, not even just by force, but by the public, like the public, like throwing tomatoes literally at women who are kind of shaking their booties out in public? I have no problem with that. The problem with the libertarian or the classical liberal is, no, we're going to die for their freedom to do that. I don't agree with it, but I'm not willing to do anything else. What kind of position is that? Well,
where does society trend if that is the case? If that is it
just trends to more debauchery, which is, people say, well, you're just using a slippery slope. I don't care if I'm using a slippery slope, because there's clearly a connection to liberalism as the highest peak of good and what you see today, which is every type of way you can express yourself and imagine to express yourself is totally fine. Because liberalism says so. What? Well, okay. Is there any pushback at all? Like, is there any pushback from a classical liberal or a libertarian when we see something indecent in public? Well, they're just expressing themselves. This is what America is. Well, people are rejecting that. They're saying, well, no, there's got to be some thing that intervenes that can supersede this loyal, cherishing worship of liberalism itself. Just anything expressed you can do, as long as it's consent-based and it's not hurting people's property or their body. It's not hurting them. It's not causing bruises or blood. It should be okay. Well, people are rejecting this now, and now they're being called woke right for rejecting this.
Well, what would be the alternative then? I mean, you're going
to just absolute liberalism?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have a certain way in which you're going to say, well, I want things this tight, but not tighter than this. And you're going to have a certain way in which I want the state to be active this far, but no further. And I want culture to be strong or thick, but not too thick, especially as a creative person. That's where we find ourselves as an artistic person myself. On the right or not on the left. I'm like, well, I'm very open. I'm very, very liberal in my ability to listen to other people and to try to inhabit their mind, which is probably based on intelligence more than, well, intelligence mixed with some sort of personality quirk or particularity. But I don't want the return to, I mean, it's not going to return there, but I don't necessarily want like a hardcore, well, it wouldn't even be fascist. Like, I don't want to, well, there's going to be church ladies and school marms wherever society is. So I want them pointed in a way where I can still have the freedom to be creative and yet the safety to not live among debauchery and grossness, baseness. I don't want to be debased, right? Yeah,
I understand. It is a line that you have to examine. But I think if you asked me, well, how do you implement this? I'm not under this delusion that you can just suddenly hit a button from top down and make this happen. What I see is that for people like myself, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I hold a very specific position on duties, position on what's considered indecent, right, in public, and so you can't do this, what it is I'm suggesting without multiplying your view. And that means having children, raising those children. Look at it like from an Amish view, for instance, or a Mormon view. They're right about one thing, is that they know that the multiplication of your view through human beings is what gives you some sort of leverage. And it's not the type of leverage where you just hit a button and then the government's on your side. It's more like
the long march through the gene pool.
It's like 10 generations or more. So I'm not under this view like, oh, that guy's crazy, he's going to get into government. Well, no, that wouldn't work. It wouldn't actually work to be like, in a pluralistic society that's so diverse in its views and its theology and everything else, you couldn't actually hit a button if you're still in the absolute minority of the people, right? But it would make more sense that, like, let's say you go into a covenant community or something, or even a soft covenant community where it's not legally that, but it's culturally that, like a type of ghetto in a sense. You go in there and you recognize immediately what's permitted, what's not. You kind of see, maybe you should watch yourself. You don't know the consequences. You're just kind of you're in the weeds. You're in the line, in the lion's den or whatever. This could exist and still have a massive impact on people. So it would be a geographic first, wouldn't it? It would be like a geographic phenomenon where you go into a place and you go, oh, they do things differently here. I'm going to kind of keep my cool here. I'm not going to just pull down my pants and start twerking here. If you do, maybe something happens. Maybe something happens here. Like just that, even though that's very subtle, That's not a security guy with a cross, right? Waiting to use the baton. That's something deeper that we all sort of recognize, which is there is a potential social consequence around every corner. But under pure liberalism, pluralism, you don't even know, you can't even identify what the through line of decency would be. Whereas when when it's more consolidated, the architecture looks different. The streets look different. People walk even differently, perhaps. They talk differently. You can pick up on the collection of these things, and you can't reduce it to just one of those characteristics. But you recognize what it is. You go, oh, there's something here. I have to compose myself accordingly. Do as they do in Rome, or let's say Japan is a good example. If you go to Japan, not only are there laws there, but there are cultural expectations and things you can and can't do. In fact, there's things that you can't do if you're not Japanese. I like that. I wouldn't come in and say, no, that's not fair. You have to let me in as the white guy who's non-Japanese to experience the fullness of Japanese culture. Well, no. The fullness of Japanese culture is that only Japanese experience some of the fullness of Japanese culture. That's a part of Japanese culture. So Japan is a good example of like an identity, an ethnic and cultural identity that you adhere to if you go there. You don't just upend it because of liberalism, right? Is that authoritarian?
Well, I think liberalism tries to, but Japan is strong enough in its identity and not cowed by shame. Actually, their honor for themselves is greater than the shame that liberalism can provide. But there is different forms of erosion. But that being the case, what about America?
Well, America, admittedly, I'm not also under this view that we have a very clear identity. I know there's people on the right who like to think so. They like to think that, well, it's Christian. Well, if you really look at it, it's more deistic, right? I would have my own pushback against the founding fathers and their views. I think they were a little too ambiguous, a little too nebulous about who God was, what that meant. They knew to include a general creator in the language, but they never really extrapolated on that, did they? And it sort of left it open.
Isn't that awesome? I mean, just as an experiment, if all these different places, all these different countries get to make their own constitution and formalize their belief system, isn't that kind of cool to have at least one country try to do that?
From what perspective? Like just crafting a constitution in general, just like writing a document?
That maneuver to leave God open-ended allowed the entire European continent to bring itself and plug into and then adopt the American project, because there was nothing that specified or excluded them on that level. Pragmatically,
you could say it was a good maneuver, but from my view, if it's not based in the rigor of truth itself of who God is, and allows people to ad hoc borrow a general a deity that just kind of is out there and say, oh, he gave us rights, and you can go, well, do you have any duties? And you're like, no, I don't have any duties. It's just a general God. That gives me value as a human being and the quote right to these amenities. Like I have a right to amenities, and so God says so. And I go, who's God? And they say, oh, it doesn't matter. It's just a general one. God gives me. I used to be someone who used to argue, God, well, rights don't come from government. It comes from God. Duh, you liberal. And now I'm like, no, that's actually still not true. God doesn't give you rights. God doesn't give you any sort of privileges. You don't get extra stuff. You're given a life from a Christian view that's a gift, and with the gift is an obligation because you're made in the image of God.
Yeah.
And
you're faulty too, so you have an obligation to fix your crap.
Yeah, absolutely. But from a specific paradigm. But liberalism itself, and I would argue even the sort of deistic, roughly Protestant paradigm that that the American project is derivative of, it doesn't really get to the core of that. It kind of just like, it gave us some good sort of innovative programs to run society to make it workable. But my argument is that, like, if something's workable in the near term, and even if it lasts 50 to 100 to 200 years, what's not workable about it is going to percolate out. It's going to show. And I think what we're seeing now is the sort of rashes of a classical liberal Enlightenment informed paradigm of living. And we're starting to go, oh, we're itching now. And then,
Okay.
and people are like, well, the ointment, James Lindsay's coming in and saying, the ointment is more liberal, more liberty. Can you just put more liberty on your arm and maybe the rashes are going away? For instance, James Lindsay doesn't have a philosophical justification for why women ought to have more children outside of just pragmatism, that we need more people. It's not a moral obligation for women to take on the duty of not only producing the next children, but also raising them. From a Christian view, that's embedded, right? That doesn't mean we're going to police it where you go to jail if you don't do it. It's just that what you talked about with propaganda and sort of the narrative influencing society, that would be a violation of liberalism to come in and start like, making social consequences for women who don't pursue that. There are social consequences for men not being, quote, men in society.
Well,
So
less and
just
less and less, and I think.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, less and less. But that's the thing, is like, without the duties, without the basically there's an ontology of men and women, and we are built differently, and because we're built differently, it lends us to different duties in society. And so that's sort of been rejected. Like, people blame postmodernism on that, but it's more than that. It's more than a blame on postmodernism. It's not just a phenomenon of redesigning words and women could be men and there's no rules to anything. It's more than that. It's that liberalism basically paved the way for that phenomenon. And then yet you get these classical liberals arguing against the wacky left who are redefining words and saying men could have babies. And they're not seeing that it's all sort of downstream from the thing they're defending to begin with, which is the philosophy that you're free, do as thou wilt, so long as you don't hurt somebody physically or take their stuff. And that I'm saying that, along with many other men and women, we reject that as a sustainable worldview for society. And it's going to collapse if you keep reaching out to liberty above all is the virtue for life.
You brought up something that's my trigger word. You brought up truth in the context of God. How does one discover the truth of God?
Well, from a Christian view, it's revelatory. So there's only really two options for epistemology. One is theonomous, which is top-down, delivered from God, and we discover. Or it's autonomous, and it's bottom-up and built from your reasoning. You just add on to the thing, and you just say, that's true until it's not. That's true until it's not. We figure out more. The latter has been mostly influencing American society in the West and developed nations.
And it works in the material realm.
It works. Yeah, you can do stuff if you hold that view, but you could also do stuff from a holding a view of a theonomous view of epistemology, that God through revelation, that science would be the lowest form of epistemology. That would be downstream from everything else that's assumed. Like, to do science, you have to assume a mind. You have to assume that we're not totally determined in a sense, unless you want to be in a contradiction. You have to assume that your faculties are valid, or at least trustworthy to an extent. You have to assume the regularity of nature to do induction. You have to assume without any evidence that tomorrow is going to continue the way it did yesterday and today. So there's all these metaphysical assumptions and philosophical assumptions that are sort of just ad hoc taken for granted, which, by the way, the entire Enlightenment theory basically said we don't have to question how we justify these starting positions, like what is a mind, what is a soul, what is will, what is all of these things, what's logic, what's the ontology of logic. They stopped asking these questions. They said these are all self-evident. Another problem I have with the founding fathers' language, there's nothing self-evident.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Yeah, they just declare self-evident.
Well, that's why they had guns in their second law.
Yeah, right.
That's the ultimate.
Right. Yeah, well, that's actually more of a true claim that, like, if descriptively force is, not even force makes right or might makes right, force just is. It can be practiced, right? You can demonstrate that it is. But the self-evidential aspect of the philosophy, when you say what's truth, I would break it down into those two things. I don't think there's a third option, by the way. I've asked people to give a third option. Either truth is autonomous and built upon itself, but always changing because of that. Reduces to a sort of a nominal view, or it's top down and there's a source to truth. There's a being connected to truth. People say they ask the question, "What is truth?" For instance. But from a Christian perspective, the appropriate question is, who is truth?
What does that maneuver afford? Going from what is true to who is true. That's a completely different...
Coherency. Coherent. Like if you take a coherent approach, a what itself can't be the basis for truth, the standard for truth. Like even a proposition itself is downstream from something else that has to be true. So propositions, we say, well, you can make these first order or second order statements and we can call them true or not. And then you'd say, well, to determine whether they're true, we decide whether they comport with reality or not. And we call that, quote, truth until they're not, right? We've seen it when that changes, right? So it can't be true if it can change. Whereas truth as a being accounts for everything encapsulated as far as justification is concerned, everything that's included in the pursuit of truth, like I listed, mind. If truth is a what justifies mind, the ability and the for you and I to have an evaluator look at things, internal thoughts, external statements, the world, evaluate these things and participate in something that's ultimately immaterial. How do you justify from an empirical position the immateriality of the thing you're participating with? Is truth physical, like a material? Can you weigh truth? You can't. Is it under a rock? No. So when we talk about, well, what's the status of these things? We know that empiricism, materialism, physicalism, scientism cannot justify the things they're assuming. So you ask them, what's the ontology? For instance, the laws of thought, I use this, Benjamin, on people. The laws of thought, the three laws of thought, the classical laws, okay, are they abstract or concrete? They're not concrete, right? There's not a thing called the law of identity that you can hold, right? As like an apple. So we know they're abstract. But where are they? What's their status in reality? Well, a materialist can't answer that question. So now, given that the laws of thought are abstract, and we know that abstractions are mind dependent, would you agree? Like, is there any abstraction that isn't associated to a mind?
Well, I mean, that's kind of like a circular definition. If the definition of abstract would be a pattern that my mind continually conforms to in such a way that it provides coherence and over time through my experience allows me to predict consequences and adapt accordingly.
Right, but would you say that entire schema you just listed is conceptual? Like what you just described, like a pattern itself is conceptual. Like there's nothing called identical to a pattern. Like we name a thing in the world a pattern, but the thing in the world itself is not identical to the concept of the pattern, right?
I guess this. Yeah. It's the way in which we transmit it. So I might be describing something concrete and using abstractions to communicate that. I don't see how these patterns aren't concrete. They're just something that we have to use abstract language in order to communicate with each other. I'm not even being concrete about that. I'm just saying that it just seems like we're just using the mind. So of course we're going to be using abstractions because that's how the mind perceives and communicates.
That's what I'm saying is that if it's the case that we can't come to truth without appealing to something non-concrete, then the truth must necessarily include something immaterial. Right.
Yeah.
So it's part of it. I'm not denying the external material world. I'm saying that the concept pattern or even external world is a metaphysical statement.
For all I know, matter is an expression of something that's greater than matter. Like maybe matter isn't the ground of being. Maybe the ground of being is being expressed through matter, and then I interact with matter to a certain percent. Of my life.
I agree.
To a certain degree.
And our interaction with matter, the way in which we evaluate and categorize it doesn't happen out there. It happens in here.
Yeah, it doesn't come from matter. It comes from my perception and my interaction, my relationship to matter. Okay. Therefore, who would be a greater container through which to explore and to understand reality.
Who would be a who-ness, a person.
But that's dependent. That's because that's not because God is a who so much as I'm a who. And I'm just saying, because I'm definitely a monotheist. But I have utter, I can't even say I have utter humility because that's not a statement of humility. Humility is a claim. It's not necessarily a statement, but all I know is that God is greater than me, and my who is greater than the what's. So God could be even more than a who in another dimension that I don't even know. So, but who is still the best way or the highest way that I can comport in the fullness, because it then encapsulates the fullness of me.
Right. That's what I'm saying is that if God, even from your, if you take a sort of more broad approach to God as a being, as a necessary being, if the truth includes you and I and everything that we experience personal. The first time.
Hey, Jimbob, we're breaking up. Let me make sure it's
true. What's the first thing you do?
Or mine? I'm sorry.
I'm not sure.
Can you go back on that? Oh,
sorry. Yeah. I was saying that from even a monotheistic of God existing, if God is the being, your experience that gives you all of your faculties, so that your reasoning and your mind and your participation in the world is all inclusive. So it includes the material, it includes immaterial, it includes conceptual, abstract, concrete. And so what I was asking is, what is the first thing we do as human beings when we believe that we've come to the truth of something? What's the first thing we have an impulse to do?
Love it.
Well, yeah, I think we come to we might come to an excitement about it, but what ends up being the value of truth once you have it? Like in practice, isn't it the case that we end up sharing it? Like we experience truth as personal. We go, oh my gosh, light bulb. And yet notice that nobody with a light bulb experience just sits with it as if that's the achievement. What we do is we share it with other people. And so what I'm saying is truth is also participatory, that the experience of truth isn't reduced to the proposition of the claim, that we actually, in action, we share the truth. We're doing it right now. We're talking about the truth of the reality, the woke stuff. We're in participation. And so we are who's, we are persons. And so you can't separate the personhood and the exchange of our energy in sharing the truth and participating in this exchange called truth without the person. And so when I go, okay, well, the ultimate standard for truth then must include personhood, because you cannot remove personhood from the participation of truth. Otherwise, truth is something that's outside, and personhood is this weird, separate thing altogether, like an entirely different paradigm that
or some sort of simulation that our simian minds creates in order to
The alternative would be solipsism itself, but that's incoherent. Like if there's two options and one is simulation theory, then truth itself would be illusory. That'd be like saying reality is illusory, the statement. It's self-refuting, because if you said reality is illusory, the word reality and is couldn't be illusory if it was true. Does that make sense? You're pointing to something universal called reality, but you wouldn't even have access to that if everything was illusory. So statements would then be impossible at that point. And so that's why, at least creating that sort of a dilemma, you can reduce it and say, well, no, it's like saying truth is not absolute. That itself is an absolute statement about truth. So there's a way to apophatically cut out all of the incoherency. And what I'm saying is a really big question, Benjamin, but the question of why is truth a who? Why is it necessarily a who? To exhaust why that's the case would be to dismiss all of the impossible views. It's like a colander, if that makes sense. Like an apophatic colander that reduces.
Well, we know truth is not when, and we know it's not where. And you're saying that what is insufficient because that is a category of being that is so particular that it's always that's nested in a what and a when.
Yeah, it's particular. Yep.
Then there's truth as a how, which that makes sense. It's like truth is something that allows you to have more interaction with possibility, to understanding, how something happens. And
how
then
and why,
on top
too.
And then on top of that would be truth as a why. Truth does come in response to a question. So somehow a truth does have a quality of question and answer in it. It does have this, I don't know, I know dialectic is a bad word in this kind of domain of discourse, but there's this proposition, there's this invitation, there's this open-endedness, and then there's this trial and effort. And I think that empiricism gets a lot of that stuff right. It puts things in the proper order. But when you get to who, that the empirical scientific mindset's like, no.
Also, why? Yeah. Also, why? Though.
But it regards those questions as something that we can table for the time being, so that we can do the work. It doesn't necessarily. But once society says that those things don't even exist, then you're in the scientist, and you're in the scientism. You're no longer open to the actual fullness of being, of these deeper questions. But when you get to who, this introduces a radical subjectivity. This is where we depart from something that can be empirically validated, something that is true for all time, for all people, unless you make the Christian claim that Jesus Christ is the Lord and Savior for everybody. And then I would have to say, well, who is Jesus?
Right.
Like, tell me who is Jesus. And can you tell me who is Jesus? You would have to actually become Jesus in order to relay Jesus to me, or
I would disagree on
the conditions by which I can meet Jesus for myself.
Yeah, I would
like that, right?
Yeah, I would disagree with that last part, but leading up to the last part, I would agree that the important thing you said is actually the why. Is like, if people hold to a what as truth, a set of propositions that comport with reality, the question of why ought we pursue that can't be embedded in the descriptions. Does that make sense? So like if you empirically come to the claim that X causes Y, you can accurately assess and describe reality. But the question still becomes, well, why are we pursuing accurate descriptions? Why should we? Is it a moral position? Is there any teleological imperative to doing this? When you ask an atheist or a secularist, I debate them all the time, and I ask them this question: why ought we pursue truth over falsities? You know what they say? They say, well, it ends up being pragmatic. But then I go, can it be pragmatic to hold a false belief? I mean, that's Jordan Peterson's entire Christianity. I don't advocate for that, but I'm just saying it's a good clapback, because if it's the case that, well, I hold Christianity to be true because it's pragmatically advantageous, it's like, okay, well, that's not a good enough reason to be Christian from my perspective, but it is a good counter to the atheist or the secularist who says we ought to pursue truth for pragmatic reasons. Well, too bad. Holding false beliefs can be very pragmatic then. So that's not a good enough reason. So
can I riff on that for a second?
Yeah.
And maybe I'll end up where you're taking me. But
Sure.
we can describe like a question, why am I hungry? Or why do I eat food? It's like, well, because your body metabolizes things, and we discover and we explore why this happens and how this happens. And the hunger would just be the living response to engaging with this activity. So why do I pursue truth? I'm just hungry for truth. That's how I am. So then we can question, well, what does the pursuit of truth metabolize? Like, what is that describing about the human being, that we have this desire for truth? It doesn't have to have a greater why than that's just, for some reason or another, we're hungry for this domain, this
I understand.
mind that we've evolutionarily became sculpted with, is just exploring this domain of reality, where the search for truth, curiosity, is just a manifestation of a lower form of metabolism.
I would
on a
push
higher
back
plane.
on that, because your example, your analogy of being hungry doesn't tell us why we ought to eat and keep ourselves alive. That's a value judgment outside of the description
Why do the oughts matter then? Like, why does ought have value?
Ought has value because even if you come to a debate about truth, you're already assuming an ought that people should be consistent and logical. So, like, if you're fallacious in your reasoning, and so the person goes, "So what?" You're just you become a sophist if you say, "So what?" Who cares? I'm totally fine with all contradictions. Well, at that point, yourself from the pursuit of truth, because you're okay with there's duty to pursue coherency. So debating itself or debating why truth, why not truth, you're already gone from that. So what I'm saying is that you can't really live a life and everything that it includes without assuming daily a meta-ethical position. Like we are. What if it's the case, Benjamin, that the way you describe being hungry and the pursuit of truth, what if it's the case that it's also descriptively true that we are just geared toward ought claims?
Yeah. Why ought we ought? I guess that's where
Why ought we ought, which is getting
ought
into what is called a presuppositional argument or a transcendental argument, is that the question of debating, the question of why ought we debate is one question. The question of what worldview justifies that we're even capable of debating, that's a bigger question. And so when you get into these questions, which are all very interesting to me, we're getting into worldview versus worldview, as opposed to particular claims versus particular claims.
Yeah, yeah. I think that a lot of the atheists would say, to end suffering, they do have a value somewhere, right?
That's true, but then they would have to bite the bullet and say, well, okay, let's take a Malthusian approach. If it's the case that you believe wholeheartedly that eliminating 2/3 of the population would actually drastically minimize suffering for a sustainable amount of time, they would have to bite the bullet, right?
Yeah. Well, what's the counter argument to ending
I don't know if they
suffering?
have a counter argument.
No,
if
for
it's
you.
utilitarian.
What's your?
Oh, my approach would
why
be
not
that
reduce humanity?
No, I
Wouldn't
would
that
say
be a lot
that
easier?
No, I mean, I would say, first of all, that requires defining suffering. From a Christian paradigm, feeling bad might actually be a part of a good. So in other words, when I fast, I'm suffering. It can't be immoral that I'm suffering, because if I'm seeing the suffering as a good, go to the gym. I've been trying to get these little narrow shoulders bigger. It's been suffering at the gym, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately it's like, well, the virtue of suffering, of carrying a cross, even if you don't get the outcome, is there a virtue in that? Well, from a Christian paradigm, there is. So it isn't reduced wholly to outcome. If outcome and utility is the standard for what's good or moral, you have to bite the bullet on so many wacky means toward that outcome. You have to just bite the bullet. And when you don't bite the bullet, I get people on this all the time. They just shift what the standard then is. So they say suffering. Okay, should we eliminate feeling pain? There are people born without pain receptors. Isn't it weird that they don't experience any pain, and yet we could argue that they suffer? The other thing is suffering a choice? If you and me were both tied onto one of those roasting sticks, right? We just made you and I went hiking in some weird island, and we got caught by people, a tribe, and they were just like, we're going to cook them, right? Both of us having the same exact scenario, exact scenario, same height from the fire, everything, right? Same tightness of bounded rope. It's possible that your suffering is less than mine because of our different wills. Is that fair to say? Like you can will the transcendent of suffering. You can transcend suffering with the will, even though the situations are exactly the same. So that's why these people who reduce suffering, often vegans use this argument. Sam Harris uses this argument all the time. They can't define suffering, first of all. And second of all, they can't account for the fact that the human will, that we have the will and the free will and the ability, metaphysically, spiritually, to overcome suffering if it's a condition. I mean, they cannot account for this.
What do you mean a condition again?
Like the condition, the set of circumstances, pain, being bound up over a fire, being burned alive. You can name all the worst atrocities. The question is it possible for a human being to overcome that pain and overcome suffering, given that suffering from the materialist position, from the Sam Harris worldview, is simply receptors. So it's just pain receptors.
Yeah.
Should we make everyone numb with drugs? Is that the moral good?
Well, the Buddhists would just call it an illusion. Say, yeah, you can overcome this. I can't make the Buddhist argument, but I do know that they construe suffering as a part of Maya, and it has to do with attachment. It actually has to do with being a who, and so they try to transcend the who. It seems to me.
They try, but the epistemology falls apart and the metaphysics falls apart, because if it's the case that pain is an illusion, then it's also an illusion of overcoming pain. So it would be an illusion that pain's an illusion, and it just keeps going. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like the moment you keep making statements that are illusory, you have to actually accept that something isn't illusory. And so if you push them on that and you go, well, name one thing that's not illusory, then I think that's why they become silent.
Well, I mean, that's why they meditate instead of worship.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I've done 10-day meditation retreats right before back in my more new age time in my life. And even though there was some element of value in the practice of discipline, being able to stay postured, control your breathing, control your thoughts, I would value all those things, but those wouldn't be peculiar to that philosophy, that worldview. Any human being could take that approach and say, no, I'm going to control my bad thoughts, evil thoughts, negative thoughts. But what I found by the end of the 10 days, I was like, oh, okay, so if it's all illusory, then anything I thought I gained from this is also illusory. So I just drove my little old car home. I said, okay, I appreciate what was offered there for what I did get, but ultimately I rejected the philosophy that's providing the...
I'm not convinced that Buddhism versus Christianity doesn't have some sort of genetic component, and that the content of those two practices that have grown up in these two areas doesn't speak to a predilection within the cultures and therefore the peoples that discovered them and calibrated themselves or their society through them. I'm just leaving that open because I don't believe that an American can be a Buddhist, but I do think that an Asian can be a Buddhist. I think that they can.
Wait, all of those rich trust fund babies who are leaving Starbucks with their
just don't think it's real. Like you could see it in their what's called the aura or whatever. But
and they go to a rave after anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like,
well, yeah. I know we kind of have a time constraint, so I want to dig into the who. So if we assume that the who is the proper method by which one discovers the truth of, I guess, everything, of reality, by saying God is a who, how do you, or how have you found through your who, the particular who of God? Like why Orthodox Christianity? Why Christianity at all?
Well, why Orthodox is also a big worldview question, but I would say that if there was a who, to the truth, then the truth would be revealed as a who. So I would say Christianity, even a generality of Christianity, like even a heterodox view of the narrative of Christ, that is consistent with my view that if God is a who, there would have to be a way in which we knew God was a who and not a what. And so it would then filter out any other religious view or God view that didn't have a sort of revelatory mechanism to establish or deliver the who-ness of God and the truth. Now, it does whittle out a bunch, right? It whittle out a bunch that don't have revelation. And so
could you define revelation for the sake of...
Well, I would just say revelation would be the mechanism through which God, in my case, the triune Trinitarian God, would reveal himself over time through people in matter, in space-time.
So revelation is perception, but it's a heightened perception?
Yeah, I think revelation itself would be, even though in time, like let's say a theophany, the experience one would have of the plurality of God in an instance couldn't be reduced. It would have to be like supra-rational, because it would have to transcend and sort of supersede the notion of how things currently operated. You know what I mean? Like it would suspend a type of regularity of nature. It would have to be above nature. It would have to be supernatural. It couldn't be natural. In a sense,
it couldn't be like a plant or a mushroom.
Yeah. But also, I want to be careful because, it could be totally natural to God. And this is what makes the distinction between God's nature and created nature, is that it's totally proper to God's nature to be able to do that, whereas it's not proper to our nature to somehow wave a wand and violate what we consider regularity or how we normally perceive a tree or this or that. That's all created. So if revelation is simply the mechanism through which God presents himself through time, and that revelation has been delivered. Now, if you believed in revelation, these are all conditional statements. If you believe in revelation and you believe God revealed himself in time, space, matter, then you would necessarily, especially as someone who proclaimed Christianity, would have to take your current Christian view, your current denomination, and you'd have to trace it back through time to not only Christ, but pre-Christ, incarnate. But
you would have to be convinced before doing all that work that Christ was the incarnation of God.
Yeah, or even that the basic statement that God would necessarily, for epistemic reasons, would need to reveal himself in some way, and that ultimately is a person who's knowable. And so, the knowability of the who-ness of God, I think if you keep God as a what, there's no grounding for, like we just went over, there's no grounding for the who-ness of how we participate with each other. Like it's totally unknowable. Like you don't know what like for instance, what does personhood mean in the human sense? Like we're both human nature, right? So if we're both human nature, but that's the only category for what we are, and there's not a personhood or an energy to us that's different, but that's proper to our nature, then it would follow that we're all the same because we're all human nature. We're all actually the same actual person. If you don't have this distinction between nature and person.
Okay.
That you and I both have a distinction. We share nature, but we don't share person. We're not the same person.
So is this where you smuggle in the concept of a soul?
Yeah, spirit. I would say human beings. I would say it's actually impossible to even talk or argue or appeal to your own experience without assuming a tripartite aspect to your existence. So you would have a body, which is proper to being human, but you have a mind and a soul. In Orthodoxy, you could call something
your
like
subtle
this
body.
the nous. Yeah, your metaphysical organ that's interacting. But you have a body, you have that aspect, your mind, and you have a spirit or a soul. And so the soul being something that kind of animates you. You're not a mechanism. Now, from an evolutionary view, from a materialist view, this is what's so terrible about their view, is that if you reduce humans to particulars, there's no universal category called a human being. There's just a particular organism. And from that view, if it's strictly mechanical and biological, anything that you call an evaluation or a thought or a belief is all just an effect, a superficial, epiphenomenal, you would call it, effect of the body doing something. That's it. Mm-hmm. Your beliefs, your thoughts, everything you argue for, what you value, is all sort of like fizzing or let's say vapor from a boiling pot of water. It's just an effect. It's an after thing. It's totally determined.
And that's insufficient for you.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's insufficient logically. Here's why. Because events in the world, like a waterfall or a tornado, those aren't true or false, right? Because they're events. You wouldn't say there's a true tornado and a true blade of grass. They're just objects that are in event mode.
Okay.
So only
that makes sense.
You would say the proposition, perhaps, if you granted yourself propositions about the tornado, a description, that could be true or false. Like the tornado is a refrigerator. Well, that's a proposition. But the thing is, under strict mechanistic determinism, on a strictly materialistic view of the world, there's no meaningful difference under that worldview between events out there in the world and events in here. Because in here, from their view, is also just material events happening in reality.
Yeah.
And if your evaluations are simply material events in reality, the materialist actually has to special plead and say, well, all other events out in the world are not truth apt. None of them. But there's this one in the world that is, and it happens to be my own thinking and reasoning. And you go, okay, cool. Is your own thinking and reasoning completely and strictly material? And they say, of course, I'm a materialist. You go, okay, cool. What's physically different about your brain activity than any other event that makes your brain activity, what gives it this special privileged position of being truth apt? They can't answer this question. You need a metaphysical, immaterial paradigm, a category that's not reduced to strictly events and just percolating mechanisms that are just spitting out random, just effects like pure chemistry. You don't say chemistry itself is true or false, but yet the materialist who debates says your worldview is false and mine's true. And you go, by worldview, you mean chemistry, right? And they're essentially saying your chemistry is false and mine's true.
Oh,
chemistry can't be false.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
There's no false chemistry.
But if you step from, I think, one step up away from that, and you say, well, I have a soul, but everything has a soul. I can relate to, I think, something that makes it special. I have a couple cats, right? Mm-hmm. And I know the cats are kind of interchangeable with other cats until I raise them and I begin to invest my time and my care, my attention mostly into them, that my attention evokes something of a soul in them. And there's a relationship that happens between me and the cat. Now, I wouldn't have the same kind of relationship with the tornado, but I could see through a narrative / imaginal framework that the tornado is an expression of my relationship or is a part of my relationship to the land. And it gets me to know the land. And the land that I live in, if it does have tornadoes, has this dangerous aspect to it, but it still has this spirit or this soul that is very damaging and awesome and terrifying, but I still have some sort what I'm basically laying the groundwork for is kind of some sort of panpsychism.
Right, I would reject it. I would reject it.
So, but that's not sufficient for you.
I'll tell you why.
Going to the next step of everything has a soul. It's a descendant of, or like kind of bubbling out of like some some sort of plane of existence of nous or spirit or something like that's not enough.
No,
it's
I
still
would
kind
tell
of
you,
true, right? You can still encapsulate that. And
I would say the world is in movement, but the difference between your cat and a tornado is that your cat has a type of will. I wouldn't say it's human will. From a Christian perspective, you would delineate between the kind of will a human has and the type of will an animal has. And then you'd maybe get to simpler animals, and then maybe there's some point where they're just in strict sort of
The
reaction
algorithm.
to
You can see,
stimuli.
you can see flies like they just have an
Right.
algorithm.
I would say that a cat, given that it has a type of will that's not identical to human, the soul, if you wanted to use the word soul of a cat, would be the animation of its will. But a tornado, I wouldn't say has a type of will, because the tornado in it itself is made up of distinct other things that then make it a tornado. And so there's no being, there's no point at which you're saying, well, this has a type of will and an intent. Otherwise you would judge the tornado. You know, you would say like, why did you do that? You know, like, whereas at a cat, even if it's
you're going to lecture a cat? Is that what you're saying?
You do correct a cat, don't you?
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
So the fact that you can correct a cat means you can engage with its will, but you're engaging with something that looks like it's having a type of experience, even if you don't grant it an experience of evaluating the experience. That would make the human is like, we have the capacity to have conversations about conversations in our head, that we have an experience about the experience. Whereas a cat, to our knowledge at least, is just expressing its animated will that's sort of maybe combined with its nature and its reaction to stimuli, but it has components of perception. Mm-hmm. And even if the will was so minuscule that it was still derivative of their perception, there's no evidence we would extend that type of will to a tornado that has no knowable capacity to evaluate, even at a rudimentary level, its surroundings, to make choices or act on its will. It is no different than saying like, well, the water that's bubbling out of the ground at a hot spring has a will. I would say no, it's at the effect of just pure nature, just the nature of what it is and what it does. But there's no animated soul element of a will. Whereas creatures, biological creatures, I could see how some people could actually at least make not a perfectly analogous extension of our human
I think it is that what you're talking about, that soul or that will, that animating property of the cat that allows me to form a relationship with the cat. That's what I'm actually
it can respond to communication.
Yeah. But I think, I don't know, we're getting in the weeds, but
Sure.
I just wanted to bring up that, you know, for somebody like Bill Gates, somebody who wants to save the world, you know, and block out the sun, or I think he's, I don't know, my wife says that he's the one who's having all these airplanes fly around and create the weather. I don't know if that's true or not. She's convinced it is. But it seems like on a massive level, like our mind can extend and imbue the natural world, Gaia, the earth, with a soul, with a character, with some form, if with enough components, does have something close to.
I would say the thing that you're pointing to, that's a soul itself, even if I granted that which I don't concede, I reject that wholly, but even if I like looked at it, what the thing you're calling the soul still needs adjust like a standard for what that is, like an ultimate source of what it is, to be able to point to it and say that's a type of Gaia soul. I would say that that the world, the created world, is reflective of its creator, but that doesn't mean that it's all made in its image. From a Christian view, the human being is the only creature made in the image of God. And even if a cat or a cow has a type of will, a type of animated will, it wouldn't follow that they hold the same status. But then if you keep extending that to like a tree, you're looking at things that have like a direction, like some sort of directionality. And I just wouldn't extend that and say, well, it has a soul because it has some sort of directionality. I think the directionality you're pointing to is merely the condition of reality that needs to have its own justification. Like the regularity of nature towards something that a tornado in one instance is not identical to another, yet they do the same thing. There's a universal to what that is and what it does. But it doesn't mean that it itself has some sort of soul identity, rather than the world itself is reflective of its creator, that it has a sort of it has its own constraints, it has its own guidance to it towards something, right? Like equilibrium, even. Like you wouldn't say like the soul of equilibrium, that gas finds, equilibrium if you just let it loose. Like the soul, because the thing is, each then particle of gas and molecule, you would have to say, has its own soul and will. But if it did, why is it that they're bound by the same outcome? They're determined in a sense. So I'm not rejecting determinism in the sense that like there are constraints to physical reality. It's just that if you were to be consistent, Benjamin, with the Gaia view, you'd have to actually extend the status of soul to every tiny little microscopic element of reality, and it itself has its own will, but it doesn't, because it does exactly what the gaseous laws tell it to. That there's a law that thing is actually subject to. So are you calling the thing that it's constrained to in its behavior the will, if that behavior is completely constrained by a law?
Is a human being similarly constrained by laws?
We are constrained by the laws of material reality until we're given somehow a miraculous gift, which we don't give ourselves to.
Yeah, but I'm talking about like when we go into what a human being is, like with the soul, with the ought.
We're constrained. We're constrained, but from a Christian view, because we're made in the image of God, and God, from our perspective, has a will, we necessarily, reflective of him, have a similar will, but not identical. So our will, we have the capacity to align our actions, our animated will and actions, with God or not. So we have the capacity to do that. If we didn't have the capacity to do that, we would be wet machines, and there couldn't be any moral culpability at all, because you're just doing what your nature confines.
Yeah, isn't that great though? That would be great? No guilt, no shame, no culpability. Just be a wet machine.
But that's what San Francisco is.
I know that's what we're being offered. Why not?
Why reject San Francisco?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's to say that it's great would be a contradiction. You wouldn't know if it was actually great, because even that statement, if it were true, you wouldn't know if it was great. You would be just determined to think it was great. So you wouldn't have access. You're basically saying, wouldn't it be great if there was no possible way to know anything is true, given that anything I thought was true is completely determined by law, by just strict mechanistic laws.
But there's a higher law.
Any higher law or lower law would require some sort of philosophy or investigation. But if it were true that everything is just an effect of material law, cause and effect dominoes all the way down, there's nothing you have as a mechanism that can give you a vantage point of proper evaluation, because everything would be a domino. That's like a domino being like, this is the true domino, but then it's falling, and then the next one is the true domino. Yeah. There's no evaluative process to say anything's good or great or anything like that. Or it's just, well,
that's how we got. That's the full circle. This is where we are with liberalism. And what right does Christianity have to say no? This is the wrong way to do liberalism. We can have liberty, but liberty needs to be constrained within this particular moral order, this found on this particular knowing of or articulation of the divine creator. You're
saying, what right does Christianity have to impose it?
Yeah.
Well, I would say, it has the same exact right that secularism has to populate the government and inform laws from their view, their anti-theology view or whatever. So even if you took the atheist approach, it would still be true that Christians holding positions of power, informing legislation and policing those policies from the existing system actually permits it. So if you're saying what gives you the right, well, I would say the current system gives us the quote right. If you mean right is the ability to populate and sort of enact some sort of populist view that law is downstream from your worldview. It's already the case. So where if you're talking about philosophically speaking, what is it about our worldview? I would say that our worldview, from a Christian lens, that it's our duty to participate through matter in the world. And so the extent to how far you take it can be discussed, but it doesn't stop us from being able to pursue it from a secular position and from a Christian position. So honestly, Benjamin, what I predict is going to be the most of the debate isn't going to be between the James Lindsays and the liberals and the Christians who are starting to understand, oh, wait a second, haven't we been sort of creating a vacuum of governance and pretending that we shouldn't use our theology to inform things? Well, when you vote on abortion, is it okay if I vote on abortion if it's from my theological position? Of course it is. Okay, so if passing policy on abortion is downstream from a theology, how could it be wrong from the current system we're in? It can't be. So people say, well, I'm fine with you holding a view. I just don't want you using the government to enforce your view. You say, what do you mean? Like, let's say there was a Christian who was pro-social programs. You know what I mean? They aligned with a liberal atheist on a social program. Would the liberal go against the Christian because he's voting for a social program that's identical to the leftists' view, what they're voting for? Would they reject it simply because it was informed by a theological view? I've not gotten a straight answer from a secular on this. Where I say, secular, religious, they both vote for the same thing, but the secular habitually holds this view, this policy. But the Christian somehow agrees with the policy, but it's from a different perspective. Is it wrong now because it's from a theological view? It can't be. So, I mean, that's the thing. That's what gives Christians the right. Christians have to stop feeling guilty because of Ben Shapiro's and all of the classical liberal conservatives telling them, no, we don't do that. We don't take our theology into government. That's where you draw the line.
I don't think Ben Shapiro is necessarily the best right one.
Well, he doesn't know where he is, right? He's anti-identity, but he appeals to identity when it comes to Jews in Israel, right? So he picks and chooses. But what I'm saying is that this view that says, don't do that, that's what the woke people do. Those woke people do that. They're the ones who force their beliefs on other people. And you go, wait, hold on a second. I was caught in this mess a while back when I was more of a classical liberal, and I said, yeah, they're forcing their beliefs. Well, I'm like, wait a second. Isn't voting for anti-abortion forcing my beliefs? Am I really going to say, no, don't do that because it's forcing my beliefs? So the question, Benjamin, becomes, okay, if we agree descriptively that nobody can vote on anything without it being an expression of their beliefs, and voting turns into policy, which is force, it's literally force. I think we should all come to a flatline agreement that we're all in a competition to some extent of using our beliefs and forcing them on others. Well, it doesn't mean ultimately.
Like, what do you mean it doesn't mean ultimately?
It doesn't mean that suddenly all beliefs are forced upon, but these are two different statements. Can you use your beliefs and force them on people at all is a question. And the answer to that question, if it's yes, it doesn't follow that the entailment is that all of your beliefs would be enforced on people. I think people miss that part, especially James Lindsay.
Well, what is the constraint that's built inside of Christianity that would keep it from unnecessarily overstepping or using the state to overstep?
I think one constraint.
I guess does it have inside itself an understanding of overstepping and not overstepping? Yeah,
we can get into this, but it's a long ways away. Something called the Symphonia, where the government is distinct from the church, but they inform each other. And what happens is you make sure that the government actually doesn't get into the church, which is, if you think about it, that's the value of this, I would say, a mythical view of the separation of church and state. Like, you can have them separate identities and distinct, but somehow connected in a sense. Like, you can have separation, you can have distinction without full separation.
Yeah, it's called a relationship.
Yeah, that relationship. And so if the current church is merely scientism, technocracy, secularism, even without a
Equality.
God,
Yeah.
they're in that relationship. They're in a type of weird counterfeit, perverted symphonia, I would say. And so when you say what's the limit, I think things that are more obvious from a Christian view is like you can't force people to believe things. You can enforce behavior, but you can't actually force people to believe things. Like, for instance, I can't force someone to participate in divine liturgy. I wouldn't force the DMV to offer the sacraments. So the perversion of the church and what it is and isn't would be the first place I would look as to what would be the limitations on how it's given to society with those simple examples. And as far as like,
So I just want to drill into the Christian nationalist, or the claim from the classical liberal, or not. It's not even really a claim. It's this generalized feeling of fear about a rising Christian nationalism. Then you can critique whether or not Christians are going to use Machiavelli or non-Machiavelli or anti-Machiavelli methods to get that. But if Christianity began to use the government as an implement, it's not going to be the Handmaid's Tale, which, by the way, San Francisco is implementing the Handmaid's Tale. It's just to get, it's just a transaction for women to sell their babies to.
Sure. Which is, isn't that the great irony, Benjamin, is that the Handmaid's Tale, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but even the origin was like more of a critique of Islam, if anything. But in the modern realm, they're like, that's what the Christians are going to do. Well, no, let's look at the facts. Christians have it embedded in their worldview and their deontology to reproduce, and we show the numbers that we reproduce without force. We can do that. It's a part of our duties, right? Secularism has no duty to reproduce. I've debated several. Do you have a duty to reproduce? No. Well, it's secularism that's actually producing this phenomenon, largely the phenomenon of under replacement populations. Modernity, secularism, technology, I wouldn't blame it fully on the secular worldview, but the combination, they're more vulnerable to lack of repopulating than we are. So Handmaid's Tale is a total myth. I would say it's a fetish of theirs. They almost like, based on some of the rhetoric, they almost like want it to be the case to prove that we're so bad.
Around,
So you don't get, so that's false. But yeah, what were you saying about
well, I'm trying
Christian
to
nationalism, right? What is it?
Yeah, Christian. What would it be? What would be the aesthetic of it? Because I don't think of it as being as scary as some people.
That's not
take it to believe. I mean, the worst that I would worry about would be the stymieing of creative thought. But at the same time, like a decrease in wet ass pussy lyrics would probably be a good thing that I would be on board with.
Cultural pressure, propaganda, like we touched on in the beginning. People assume that if you even identify or can sympathize with a type of Christianity that extends itself to a nation level, they think it's automatically like people being thrown off of buildings and all this stuff. Whereas really,
they never think of like late Renaissance Europe.
How about this? How about a revitalization, right? How about a revival of beauty? How about a revival of aesthetics? I think
that's what's drawing a lot of people to the church, a lot of young people to the church.
Absolutely. Like, why not make our buildings beautiful instead of brutalist boxes that are gray and replaceable? Why not assume some sort of social order where we hold each other to account for public behavior? How could that possibly be a bad thing, other than it's a sin or transgression or heresy against pure unbridled liberalism, where you can do anything?
I know the classical liberals, having gotten their chops through the anti-woke movement, capitalized a lot, whether intentionally or no, on the despicableness of, let's say, pride and the overextension of different race and sex based rights movements, which is kind of a perversion of the word rights and movements. But they on an aesthetic level, a lot of their audience was caught up in fighting against that really bad behavior. But I don't see where they have solidly said, okay, this is how we know what is good and bad. This is how we know what is debaucherous and not debaucherous. They kind of want to go back to just keep it in the bedroom, but I think we've seen that bedroom isn't a private space. It goes everywhere.
It's not. That the whole idea.
But the Christian, but then the counter for that, briefly, the counter to that was this beautiful series of advertisements for Kamala Harris or for the Democratic campaign, where there was this great, it was totally a tell. It was this great, it was disgusting, but there's this guy masturbating in his room, watching porn on his little phone. And then this Republican senator comes in. Like the Christianity, because I think that's the classical liberal fear is that you can't get into my room. You can't tell me what I can drink or what I can consume or what I can't
That's
consume.
actually already untrue. That's what I'd like to point out to you. That's already false. There are already laws on what you can and can't drink. There's already laws on what you can and can't purchase. If it were the case that they figured out you were doing something in your room, they would break into your room. Now, I'm not saying things like that, like your sexual proclivities enacted in your room. Obviously, from a Christian perspective, maybe it's not obvious to people. That is clearly not the first priority. Like the first priority is out there in the world, things like abortion, things like upping the propaganda for families, like making families look good, like a good choice for women. Feminism is a whole other thing you can do another podcast on, is that the feminist narrative alone is enough for Christians to sort of consolidate and push against, because just the propaganda of feminism telling women right from a very early age that, not only they can do anything, but typically if you choose motherhood, it's kind of like a stigma now, where it used to be a stigma otherwise. It used to be a stigma to not be a mother. It used to be a stigma to be the lone Chelsea handler who's becomes 50, has no legacy, has no husband, has no children, is just hoping to get invited to a wedding to talk to one of the groomsmen or whatever. This is not something that is showing any good fruit for society. And we're saying, a Christian is saying, we're not going to police that you. If you don't have if you're not going to be a wife and a mother, we're gonna come in with the guns. This is a fetish from the left side and the classical liberals. What we are saying is that if you were to counter the current propaganda in school, academia, higher level of education, Hollywood, politics, all of the narrative is women go be awesome, go get a lanyard, right? Go win the corporate game. This is pure materialism. The good news is that women themselves are starting to see they've been sold a sort of Faustian deal. They're starting to wake up to this. They are. So if that's the case, if we start with something simple, not breaking into your room because you're whacking it, something simple like, I don't know, investing in counter narratives for what it is to be a mother. Maybe it was actually a good thing. Maybe these early anti-suffragettes, maybe they were right about the consequences of pushing some sort of egalitarian fantasy onto the world. They were right. And guess what? They were so right that the suffragettes at the time made it difficult, if not impossible, for them to show up to preliminary sort of votes to vote against their own vote. What does that tell you about the narrative then? Well, they were right. Those women were right. The most valuable place for a woman, generally, I'm not saying there's not exceptions. The most valuable place for women in society is being mothers. They think that's a bad thing. No, that's a beautiful thing. That's an important thing. That's a necessary thing for societies. They're saying, oh no. I want to work for Nike. I want my money. I want my Corvette.
And any pushback to that is it leaps to, well, you don't want me to own property, which is probably not the case either. But look at that.
Yeah, I've been asked that before. I don't really care. Ultimately, I hold a view that even men don't actually own property. They lawfully own property to an extent, and the extent is when they no longer own the property. So the government could actually take your property. I mean, let's face it. Second, my argument that a woman ought or ought not own property, I think it comes down to if a woman owns property and she's just a woman on her own, the question isn't whether or not she can technically and legally own property. The question is, can she defend the property adequately? So, like, go ahead, say that you own property or don't own property. But the thing is, in this current system, the government doesn't actually have an obligation to defend your right or your property. They have an obligation to respond to the breaking of the law. So this kind of view of like, oh, women aren't going to own property and that's terrible. It's like, well, I'm not going to make the argument that they ought not own property and that should be policed. It's just that when it comes down to it, you're still reliant on men protecting and defending your property when it comes down
or the system.
Well, the system, which is the force arm of the system, is men, though, predominantly. And I do too. I'm not taking stolen valor. It's still descriptively true for you and I, right? Who aren't these huge buff people jumping from helicopters, right? It's still true for us that you and I even rely on the force of men ultimately to defend this idea of that you own property, that you have a right to what you're in possession of. The reality is it's determined after the event. Let's say someone's violated. It's determined after whether you're in the right, by the way. So if I have a right to self-defense and I deploy self-defense and I go, I'm in the right. Well, you can say that, but guess what? You still have to figure out if you were, right? And that takes a process in the justice system. That's another thing that becomes completely missing from these conversations. Even the rights-based people, they just assume it's self-evident you have the right. And it's like, okay, if there was no justice system and it was just you in the woods, would you really need the word right? If you did something? You
just
actually
might is sufficient.
Yeah, might is sufficient.
In the state of nature, at least.
That's right. And people just, they don't like this descript. They think that you saying that, Benjamin, they think that you're advocating for might is right. You're not. You're saying it's descriptively true that absent a governing force that's monopolizes justice and force, that without that, what do you have? You just have your might. You have your will, and that's it. So, go ahead, own property.
We got way off. We didn't answer the question of who God is, but that's okay. Maybe we can pick
God
that
is
up.
Jesus Christ, Logos incarnate, second person of the Godhead.
And who are you, Jim Bob? And where can people find you? And what are they going to find when they
I'm Made by Jimbob. I run a YouTube channel called Made by Jimbob where I do really funny commentary that's a little bit lighter on politics, culture, philosophy, religion, and all that. I'm also a cartoonist for the Washington Examiner. Been that for 5 years plus. And you can find my comics at MadeByJimbob on Instagram. I'm also at @ByJimbob on Twitter, or just search MadeByJimbob on Twitter. I should come up.
This is a great conversation. I don't know how to end it up. We went so all over the place. We need to pick back up and drill into more. I guess like just the open-ended questions for people to think about, or for us to contemplate and maybe come back to, is how America would articulate a vision of the good and of God that's proper to the direction of America, if that's even possible, and what is the actual content of a Christian nationalism, or as opposed to the classical liberal point of view, as opposed to the progressive point of view, and who's behaving more nobly in those domains, and who would rule better. And
these are good questions. I just want to add that the whole contention of Christian nationalism, what's kind of funny about the whole worry about it is that if there was competition for Christian nationalism, it's more the case that it's going to be between Christian denominations, that they're the ones who are going to be disagreeing and fighting and debating about what Christianity should be, what a Christian nationalist view. For instance, I would probably, depending on the topic, like let's say abortion, it's mostly the case I'll agree with heterodox Protestantism, evangelicalism. Maybe some of them are actually leaning more left, though. There's these general topics we would mostly agree with. But as far as governance, you're getting into a much larger category of theology and what are these distinctions between church and state and where are they merged and where are they separate, ultimately come down to who is the church. So when you ask who is God, it's just as valid of a question of saying, well, who is the church? And this is a debate that happens mostly with proclaimed Christians, by the way, and atheists and secularists and liberals are all tuned out of that conversation. So, if you're a liberal listening and you're afraid of Christian nationalism, don't worry. The stagnation and the traffic jam that would occur with just proclaimed Christians alone would be as unworkable as you see the unworkability of government itself. So you don't have to worry because there's a massive debate to be had there. So
well, I mean, maybe that's how, like, that goes back to what you're saying, faulting the founders of our nation with not defining God and faulting the scientists for just saying, let's just leave
no God. Yeah.
Let's leave those questions on the table so we can get to work. Christians picking those questions back up might end up back in the pre-Enlightenment Reformation, in the very least blog wars, if not all-out warfare, which I don't think would occur.
Yeah, well, I think what at least a good starting point is the science world, and they are acknowledging. I followed a lot of people who are science communicators who are coming to the conclusion that, okay, I valued science, but when Benjamin, you say let's get to work assumes a metaphysical claim, a teleological claim about the future and where we're headed, which then brings in not science. So these things are not, you don't separate them. You figure out how is it they have a relationship similar to what is the relationship between government and church. Well, what's the relationship between philosophy and your worldview and science and where we're heading, right? Where's this directionality? Now, the one thing I'll end with is that the major difference between progressivism and liberalism and classical liberalism, and let's say those who many want to just dismiss as Christian nationalists or woke right or crazy people, is that the liberals and the progressives have really no standard for directionality, where they're heading to. At least Christianity has that, even if you disagree with it. There is no direction toward pure liberalism. Pure liberalism is a flat playing ground. It doesn't tell you what to build, doesn't tell you how to act, it doesn't say anything. It just says, here it is. So, I mean, that's a whole other thing. So I have a lot of thoughts on that, but
you have a lot of thoughts on a lot of things.
Yeah, that's why I can talk for 5 hours on a live stream, just until I'm tired of even hearing my own voice in my ears.
Well, cool. Thank you very much for your time. I'll link to your work down there in the description. Everybody go check out Jim Bob's stuff. Have a good night.
Thanks, man. Appreciate you.